Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't it a fine occasion to be back in this heralded house? To be surrounded by so many friends, not just on this side of the floor, but some on the other side too. It pleases me to no end, some days a bitter end. The greatest occurrence of all, at least for the moment, is that I have the microphone for 15 minutes.
Hear, hear.
As long as I'm good, I can keep it, right? The greatest thing is, though, I get to say things, all sorts of things, not only to the best of my ability, nor for the entertainment of the few in here, or those watching at home, but to those who have missed my points of view, and I've missed offering them, especially to you, Mr. Speaker. Today's topic is glyphosate. Before I go any further, on the amendment, I'm against the amendment and I'm for the motion that was put down by the member from Fredericton, Gagetown, Grand Lake, whatever that's called. It's a long one. On the amendment, this is interesting. The Chief Medical Officer was named here, and although I have respect for these offices, I will tell you, my office in Southwest Miramichi Bay de Ven recently had to contact the Chief Medical Officer, and she was very gracious to get back to me, and I had a nice chat with her. But the interesting thing was, her staff members were actually chasing after an elderly lady in Blissfield because they didn't like the place where she prepared her pickles and jam. Pickles are full of vinegar, jelly and jam is full of sugar. Nobody's ever died from that that I've heard of, but in any event, her office was making her life very difficult. She seemed unaware of it. She helped correct the situation. But you live in a world where pickles and jelly is under severe scrutiny, where poor people who have a bed and breakfast are asked to build a piece onto it and another kitchen just to make jam for the people they already make it to and serve it to for 25 years. So when you see the Chief Medical Officer supporting glyphosate, yet chasing after pickles and jellies, I question that, and I will. And I'll continue to question it as long as I'm in this House, and I'm sure long afterward. Another example of how facts are never known in the legislature and how the facts never truly get out is the issue of the Department of the Natural Resources, which comes into play on this file. Some years back, the rural community of Upper Miramichi wanted to have a community forest. What occurred was industry prepared their own document stating how complex it was. The rural community of Upper Miramichi was denied, and I left myself thinking, Mr. Speaker, the people of Boys Town have lived there over 250 years, and they've lived off that land for that long. So it's interesting how industry could prepare their own document and say that people who've lived off it for 250 years would not be prepared to understand the complexities of the forest. From this time and place, Mr. Speaker, I shall use examples and situations of both the workings of the members of this House and in our forests to describe angles not yet considered in this argument. I don't pretend to be a scientist or overtly or technically knowledgeable on the chemicals used. First and foremost, let it be known that I have never personally, politically, morally, or anyway supported the endeavor of spraying glyphosate down upon the animals, their habitats and food sources, into the air we breathe, and upon the very spirit of what to me is the New Brunswick crown jewels, the trees themselves. I'm against glyphosate, and it wouldn't matter which tie I wore. I am against it, and I will be against it. I don't speak from a scientific point of view. I firmly support placing a suspension on this practice to allow some investigative research and oncoming recommendations from a task force. I appreciate this motion, and thank you to my colleague here from Gagetown. Thank you so much for this. Let's do a little history lesson, Mr. Speaker. What does history tell us when chemicals are used on people or animals, either for killing bugs or for experiments or otherwise? Think about that for a second. Take a good long few seconds and think about that. So what's at risk, really? What's at risk for us? Air quality, food safety for animals and human beings, wildlife and livestock, and lastly, the side of the debate that is so commonly avoided, what it's doing to our hardwood and why that's being done at all. What is the value to New Brunswickers to prevent the slow but certain long-term and prosperous growth of hardwood? And even if it is only a couple of percentages each year, it's still a lot. And we still have to ask what that will mean 30 years down the road. We don't know what hardwood will be worth in 40 years, or who wants it, or who needs it. And we need to think about that, all of us in here. Do the people in urban parts of our province understand the emotion and fear of those living in and near wooded areas being sprayed? They don't live in heavily wooded regions like mine, for instance. How can we fully appreciate the views of those not breathing it in at the rate some of us are, like those of us who live near Cairns River, like myself, and how it would affect them to raise their children nearby, knowing it's being taken by every breath you take? And is it poisonous? Do we know? Who can we possibly trust? For example, you walk into the forest today and you read a sign, "Don't eat the berries." So you can't eat the raspberries. You can't eat the blueberries. The deer aren't there anymore. Everybody's got their own answer. I don't know the real reason, but I can tell you that glyphosate is sprayed nearby. There's not much of a species in the brooks in terms of trout, although that has declined rapidly anyhow. There's a lot of evidence in there. A lot of hunters will tell me that although the liver was a problem for deer for the past 40 years, kidneys are now a problem, and liver is even a bigger problem. Something's doing it. We have to at least examine what possibilities might be out there. And if something is doing it to our animals, then we have to think, well, what's it doing to us too? It's an observation that any MLA worth his salt or her salt would be standing here taking a position that would actually benefit the people of New Brunswick. The unknown is the fearful, and the debate and the questions themselves. One organization says it's full of carcinogens, yet the scientists hand-selected by industry and the department say they could drink glyphosate out of a glass. I would love to be witness to that. I would love to see that, actually. I'd give anything to see them drink glyphosate out of a glass with their bacon and eggs or something. Mr. Speaker, look at the public interest. Let's look at public interest. I was told that a poll exists that states that 90% of the people of this province are against glyphosate. So whether it's not bad or really bad, 90% of our people are against it. 90%. That's a lot. And I'm guessing, I believe firmly that they identify with not wanting this to be sprayed, regardless of who they vote for, and thus making it easy to remove party politics from the issue. The subject and banning or suspension of glyphosate is for the public as a whole to once witness an electorate actually listening as a whole. Anyone in this legislature who votes against this has overlooked in its entirety the will of 90% of our population. 90%. So forget the color of your tie, forget all of that. 90% of the people that put you in these chairs are against it, whether you could drink it or whether it's killing us all. 90% are against it. That's the number that I've heard, Mr. Speaker. So, suspension of the practice of glyphosate is a proper undertaking for New Brunswickers. The forest is yours and mine, not the property of those licensee holders who wish to continue having the public front the bill for the spraying and the potential devastation caused by it. That can be no more, Mr. Speaker. Big business needs to hear the word no. Very simple word, and they need to hear it more often. And this is an opportunity, whether this is harmful or not, for them to start hearing that little word no. Very powerful word. Glyphosate reeks of corporate greed and control despite the damages it potentially causes. Here's an example of corporate greed sponsored by government, this current Liberal government, and brought to you by none other than the Liberal minister from the riding of Miramichi. This is from the 29 subsidies by the U.S. government. Essentially, IPP received a grant, I believe that's Irving Pulp and Paper. They received funds from the, where is it here? Stated that IPP received certain grants from the RDC and identified 3 separate programs: the Innovative Program, the Northern New Brunswick and Miramichi Regional Development and Economic Fund, and the Total Development Fund. Here's the kicker. The total development fund is available to only provincial government departments, crown corporations, and not-for-profit corporations. Perfect example of corporate greed supported by my colleague from Miramichi. And it's sinful. And I'm going to talk about it here because it goes right to the very essence of this issue that we speak of today. It's alive and well in this province. The members opposite know it. They need to do something for the people of the people of our province know they're incapable of governance. Incapable, Mr. Speaker. Playing games with elections, getting second jobs, lobbying. It's endless. So because IPP received these funds outside of eligible requirements, that limits the funding to provincial departments. It limits the funding to not-for-profit organizations, and it was determined that the grant provided under this program constitutes a financial contribution in the form of a direct transfer of funds. Brings me to another point. This government, and whoever else, paid for glyphosate to be sprayed, not fully knowing what it was doing, other than that it was killing hardwood so they could plant more trees. We know who wants that. That's within the 10 percentile of the public of this province, and it's a very small number in that 10. So I'll tell you today, DNR needs a forensic audit. Glyphosate needs to be suspended, or you're against the will of 90% of your population. And it doesn't matter if it's suspended, if it's banned, if it's a moratorium. There's a million plays on words. But if 9 months go by and a task force proves this isn't healthy, well, guess what? It's going to stop. And it started right here with the member from Fredericton, Grand Lake and Gagetown. So in closing, whether you're personally against it, theoretically against it, morally, politically, since we are politicians, and since nobody but the greed of the few want it, the question is, why vote against 90% of your people? Why vote against 90% of the people in Moncton and Fredericton and all the rural communities, the Acadian Peninsula? Why vote against them? Why do it? So there it is. I support the motion. I do not support the cowardly amendment. That's what it is. I thank my colleagues from Gagetown and Sussex and all other MLAs from the many political stripes who have helped thus far. This one for all New Brunswick, and the time is ripe for making a well-rounded decision supported collectively by each of us in here. And for the public, imagine that, Mr. Speaker, for the public. I encourage all MLAs in this House to be courageous, be bold, and be bold enough to vote in favor of the motion, remove your amendment, and help suspend the practice of glyphosate in this province. All of you should do it. Do it now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.